The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club. For Joseph Pearce, Vivian Dudro, or as Siri calls you, Dudro, and I continue our discussion of Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved by Hans from Balthasar. We're coming to the last two chapters of the main book, which are on Satan and justice and mercy, followed by a short discourse on hell, which is his response after this book was published to the critics. And it will cover the same themes we've covered, but more succinctly and more directly in response to the criticisms, which are, in many cases, good criticism. That is to say, this is a controversial or it's a difficult to understand position he's taking, and so he is going to respond to the critics, some of whom seem to have a goodwill and others not so much.
And they're the same criticisms that he's getting today. So,
yes,
different cast of characters, but same objections.
Yep. So, chapter 10 is on Satan. Is there a Satan? Is Satan in hell? Joseph?
Well,
do you have any?
I have something on page 113 I want to comment upon, if I can.
Okay.
So the middle of the page there, it's he's quoting from I've got look where he's quoting from, but no demonology should be constructed, since man's business is not to peer curiously into the hellish gloom, but rather to look up in gratitude toward the redeeming God. And again, I'm bringing my sort of literary side of things in, because obviously what Dante does in the Divine Comedy, allegorically, is Dante descends into hell so that he can know the reality of sin. Now, that's not sort of the same thing necessarily as demonology. He's not studying demons, but I do think it's helpful for us to look at the potentially hellish consequences of unrepented sin. And so I do think we do need to peer. I don't know about curiosity. I think we do need to peer into the hellish gloom sometimes in order to understand the absence of God, absence of goodness. And so I'm sort of not completely happy with that statement as said, without any quibble, so to speak.
Just above that, I underline this in the same paragraph, because he's talking about Satan here. Let it be said at the outset that theological hope can by no means apply to this power.
That's
that is
right.
The anti-God power we call Satan. So, for certain, Balthasar is not saying hell is empty.
No, not at all.
The question is whether we can hope for human beings.
Right. And also, if you go up a little bit farther, on the same page, at the beginning of that paragraph, he starts by saying, thus we are faced with the question of a mysterious power, for man a superior power, that somehow manifests personal attributes that clearly emerge precisely vis-a-vis the person Jesus. And then he says, let it be said that hope can by no means apply to whatever this menacing anti-God, anti-man power is. In no way is there hope for that. And I think that's very clear. But I also like the fact that he puts parenthetically, for man, a superior power. And that could be, Joseph, why he cautions against peering too much into the hellish gloom, because while the devil is no competition for God, and Jesus Christ has vanquished him utterly and completely, and in Christ's power and name and blood, we don't have to fear our spiritual foe, but people can lose sight of the fact that without that power of Christ at their side, if they think they're going to take this on or peer into it curiously or dabble out of curiosity into some of these things, they're treading in a dangerous place. And I think maybe those two, that recognition on von Balthasar is part of what we're dealing with, could be part of his caution against.
Yeah, I obviously have no problem with that. In fact, I've been teaching homeschool connections class on the Chronicles of Narnia, and in the Magician's Nephew, one of the hallmarks of magic is curiositas, which leads to you basically dabbling with the devil, ultimately dabbling with diabolism. So yes, curiositas is dangerous. Curiosity about the devil is particularly dangerous, and we certainly shouldn't go there unnecessarily. But it's just when he said we should not peer, very curiously we agree with, peer into the hellish gloom. I think we can learn something from seeing the consequences of the absence of goodness, and that's what I'm really saying. And then if, I don't know if either of you can clarify this, because I am taking this out of context, perhaps, but if I'm understanding it correctly, I think this is odd. So at the bottom of that page, Henri de Lubac says, well, this might be Hans Oswald Balthasar talking about Henri de Lubac, but it is of the essence of the gift of freedom to be able to choose one's own highest value, thereby realizing oneself for the very first time. First of all, I don't believe self-realization in a very deep sense is possible, certainly not without Christ. And what does he mean by choose one's own highest value? I mean, if it's about the freedom of the will, we can freely choose. I have no problem, but if it's sort of, it could sound relativistic that we can choose what's good for us.
Well, I think. Oh, I hear you taking a breath. Are you going to say something?
Go ahead.
Okay, so I think what this means is that man has a highest value that's been given to him by God, union with God, and man is free to choose that. I don't think that what this means is man gets to decide what his highest value is. It objectively has already been given by God what it is, but that we're free to choose it or not.
Right.
We're free to fall from it.
The freedom of choice, of course, is sacrosanct, and that's the whole hub of the issue of hell, right? But all right. I just thought there's maybe an ambiguity there which confused me. That's all. That's why I was seeking clarification.
And it's an honest ambiguity, because we hear all the day long about choosing your own values, and values are completely subjective, and even using the word value is sort of perilous in this context, because a value, I value this more,
choosing your values sounds very much, pride,
right,
self-empowerment, radical relativism,
right, right. But I think here it's God's already given man this destiny to be united with him, and we're free to choose it or not.
It's not to choose what one's highest value is, but to choose what it already is.
Correct. That's how I read that sentence.
And then, but it's good to clarify this.
Yeah.
Also, that expression, in quotes, congealed in goodness. The point there is that, could God create a creature who is free, who is, by that very fact of being created by God, therefore good in a way that it can't be lost? That is without a choice. And this has to do with the angels.
Right.
And I think it is true. I also think it's true of aborted children or miscarriages. Those are human souls. Are they created congealed in goodness? No, they can't be. There's a freedom. How that's exercised, we don't know. But just like we baptize children before they can make a decision to accept Christ, and that acceptance is given to them in our name because we pray. Still, there has to be some moment, some point where they have to ratify that either this life or the next, or between this life and the next.
That's right.
Also, I want to point out in the previous paragraph we discussed, or actually the same paragraph is higher up, where he puts the quotes around personal. That is, this is a mysterious power that somehow manifests, quote, personal, close quote. Why does he put the quotes there? Because he's going to talk later on about in what sense we can say a damned person or a damned angel is a person in the same sense that someone has chosen the highest value, which is God. That is an important point. It's kind of not perspicuous, I would say. It's not clearly obvious, but I think it's profound and important.
And he brings that up again, exactly that point, Father, on the next page, in the next paragraph, in the middle, where he says, we would have to join Joseph Ratzinger in speaking of an unperson, of the disintegration and collapse of personhood, for which reason it is characteristic of the devil that he appears without face, and why his being unrecognizable is his real strength, and so on. That he works in an impersonal, indeed in a virtually person dissolving way. So when you think about what is a person, and if you fall away from God, do you lose your personhood? And I think what Ratzinger and Balthasar are saying is, yes, you do. It's the dissolving, it's the annihilation of your personhood.
Be careful. I mean, annihilation means made into nothing. So it's
okay,
it's
good
not.
point.
I mean, and Pope Francis said something about that, which I think is questionable. But you don't cease to be, or cease to be a person in some sense. But it's hard for us to know what the difference is between person fulfilled by saying yes to God and person unfulfilled by not saying yes to God.
Right.
At the beginning of that paragraph, from which you quoted, he says a totally different question is that of to what extent the concept of person, in quotes, can still be applied to the satanic being. For being a person always presupposes a position relative to some fellow person, a form of sympathy, or at least natural inclination and involvement.
That is interesting. In other words, I'm an I to the degree that I'm relating with other persons, a thou, and ultimately the thou with the capital T is God himself, who gives me myself, but it's only in relation with him that I retain that self. So
yeah, I think the whole relationship is basically the imago Dei in us is the essence of God, which is love, and love requires the giving of yourself to another. So within the Trinity of is that a self-giving. But with us, to make many image God requires love. That's what it means, and you can't love unless there's a beloved, right? And your relationship with them. So I absolutely agree with all this. The only thing I'm pleased, I think he's cleared this up, and I think it's important because I don't know if he's later on he might. I think this does clear it up, and I'm grateful because I was a little bit confused at first because I don't think it's useful or helpful to speak about Satan or any demon as a person, right? Because we can only define personhood in the sense of looking at ourselves, right? We don't know demons, thanks be to God, or at least I hope we don't know them very well. The demons are something beyond us, and so I think the word person in relation to them is unhelpful because it's sort of humanizing them by even calling them a person, right? And I think that's problematic. But I think it's exactly what he's saying here is that we shouldn't look upon Satan in terms of personhood.
And when you think about what you've mentioned this before, Joseph, the golemization of someone consumed by sin, unrepented sin, and how this dehumanization that takes place over time. And when you you look at so many sad cases all around us of people literally losing who they are, thinking, and ironically, thinking they're choosing their true selves, and somehow in pursuit of some true self that's, I don't know where it is, and end up with no self at all. And in fact, a friend of mine who's a nurse practitioner and deals with a lot of people in bad health situations, including drug addiction and trans and all this kind of thing, she said the patients that can no longer look at her in the eye are the people who've done the greatest damage to themselves through all of these behaviors. They can't even look at her. She's trying to say, how can I help you? And she's saying, there's no you left in there. She says it's the most terrifying thing for her as a medical practitioner to meet up with this phenomenon of the person not being there anymore.
So maybe
Yeah, it's like, the effort of self-realization being self-delusional, and I think Chesterton says that the self is more distant than any star. That's the whole point. We can't know ourselves, and insofar as we can have inklings of knowing ourselves, it's always relational. It's always in relationship with the relationships we have with others that we come to know ourselves. We try to look at ourselves as ourselves, right? We're looking for something which is more distant than any star, as Chesterton would say.
So, and maybe Gollum here is the good image for this. My precious, my precious. You can only look at other people. He's consumed by this thing, and maybe there's an analogy there with the idols and so on that Scripture, rails against. In our own time, if you're consumed by honor or wealth or sexual pleasure in a sense, you're actually losing yourself and becoming more and more like the unperson, which the devil is.
And so now on page 115, this next paragraph, speaking of consumption, that's exactly the word and the image that's brought to bear here. Here we can close by returning once more to the idea of self-consumption. And in fact, as self-consumption in eternity, for a turning of the person that has been created as good against being good in general, can properly be described as a turning of the creature against itself, as perversion per se. And then if Psalm 18:26 says of God, cum perverso perverteris, thank you, then this cum can be sensibly replaced by in. He's replacing one Latin word for another, cum being with and in being in. Okay. By him who irrevocably rejects the fire of God's love, that fire can be experienced only as a consuming one. And Father was just in his homily today talking about, but there's only one fire. It's the fire of God's love, and we can either experience that in a purifying way, willingly being molded, shaped, chastised by God because he loves us, or if we turn away, then we can only experience it as a consuming one, a destroying one. Yikes.
Yeah.
So this is this is far from a book about saying, oh, don't worry about not being saved.
Final chapter 11, justice and mercy. And here he goes through. It's a difficult reflection of, well, is God just? Is he merciful? Is his mercy justice? Is his justice mercy? He's going to quote Augustine, Bernard, Anselm, Thomas Aquinas here.
Yeah, he brings out all the heavy hitters here, and in a beautiful way, too.
Yeah,
I love the quote. I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, in which case you can stop me or what have you. But middle of page 121, I love the quote from St. Anselm there of God's justice and mercy. When you punish the wicked, it is just, since it agrees with their merits. However, when you spare the wicked, it is just, because it is befitting your goodness. Yeah, and I suppose that's beautiful. But it keeps bringing me back to the beauty of C.S. Lewis, and again, the line of Mission of Wardrobe. I mean, it is just that Edmund should be punished, right? But if God chooses instead to take the suffering upon himself as an act of mercy against Edmund, it's not something which is unjust. It's something which trumps that more limited understanding of justice. It's the deeper magic rather than just the deep magic, right? It's beautiful.
But this beautiful thing is what he's criticizing here. Because just before what you quoted, he says, but at this point, Anselm's train of thought becomes confused, and it is blocked by the boulder of the Augustinian hell. And then just after what you said, he says, thus in the end, the divine will must become the root concept, for only whatever you will is just, and whatever you do not will, unjust, close quotes. That's voluntarism, not conforming your will to what is true, but what you will becomes the logos or the truth. So,
by the way, where
Where was
Father
that,
is,
Father?
he's
Sorry, I
a, he's
wasn't finding it. Where was it?
he's a couple of pages ahead of you, Joseph,
Oh, am I?
but it's the same quote from Anselm in both cases. So on Joseph, the blocked by Augustinian hell, that's 118 in our version.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
And
Thank you.
but this quote, when you punish the wicked, is just, and when you
Oh,
spare the
I
wicked,
studied twice. I see. Right.
okay, that is the same. That is the same quote, is it not? Yes, it's the same quote. So.
Oh yeah, it is. Just above that.
Yes, it's the same quote.
I'm sorry, I thought you were quoting from the below, but you were quoting from above, and so.
No, he was quoting from the same quote on another page.
I know, but above. I believe his quote is above the one I quoted.
No, you're on page 118,
No,
and he's on page 121.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Okay, but now that we've stirred up enough confusion to keep how do we sort this out, Father? What is Balthasar saying here? What is he saying here about this quote from Anselm? He says on page 121, where Joseph quoted the quote, "It's better to take the path of Aquinas." So now Aquinas, I'm assuming the Summa, he is quoting this Anselm quote again. But then what does Aquinas do with it? Between the misdeeds of the creature and the goodness of God, there is no equilibrium, which means that justice with respect to the former is subordinated to divine mercy, indeed must be virtually a mode of this mercy. So I think what Balthasar is doing in gently making a correction to Anselm is that you can't divide his justice and mercy as if they're two different operations with their rationales on either side, but that rather you have to see justice as a mode of mercy. And why? Because the argument is because everything exists out of the generosity and mercy of God. And so then on the bottom of the next page,
page 1.
My 122,
okay.
Where he's continuing this thought of Aquinas, that that creatures exist at all and are what they are, is due not to get God's justice solely, but to his goodness and generosity. And this he's quoting, that A1 add 3. These are the references to Aquinas's Summa here. That's what that is. Which means that his justice, in respect of both himself and his creatures, to be seen as a mode of his goodness. The work of divine justice always presupposes the work of mercy and is grounded in it.
Yeah.
So
that's all wonderful. I mean, Thomas Aquinas, why we should be surprised. I just want to go back, however, and say that commentary upon St. Anselm's sentence should not be seen, I would suggest, as a suggestion there's anything inadequate in Anselm's sentence, because what it's really saying, to read it in the light of St. Thomas Aquinas, when you punish the wicked, it is just, since it agrees with their merits. So pride proceeds of all. We act pridefully, and there's a fall as a consequence of it. That's just, right? That's justice. But when you spare the wicked, it is just. When you spare the wicked, it's just because it is befitting your goodness. In other words, that the act of punishment is an act of mercy.
yes,
right? If as Father was saying, that we have to experience his love as fire, either in the cleansing sense and the purgatorial sense, right? In which case the justice is merciful and having a medicinal consequence, shall we say? So I think St. Anselm's sentence is still good and solid. I think what it needed was a footnote, and that's what Thomas Aquinas provides.
Yes. Yes, and then he ends this chapter with Joseph Pieper. It was von Balthasar, I believe, Father, who told you to publish Joseph Pieper, right?
Well, when I asked him after spending an evening at his home there in Basel, what works in German would you recommend we translate and publish in Nations Press? And he who had 30,000 volumes in his house, as I counted that evening, as I didn't count them one by one, but I did an estimate of how many volumes per foot and how many feet there were in a bookshelf. He said, well, by all means, whatever Pieper has written is worthy of translation into English.
And Pieper is wonderful. I wonder if we should do one of his books on our Forum Book Club, something by Joseph Pieper.
Well, that'd be an idea. Yeah.
He's just brilliant. And by the way, he's a Thomist. But he's one of these Thomists who also, like von Balthasar, like so many of these other great minds of this last century, they just know so much about so many things, music and culture and art and philosophy, and they've read the moderns too, and yet they know how to, it's like what you said, going down to the cellar and bringing out the old with the new.
Yeah,
the best of both. That's what Pieper does all the time. I just love anything written by Joseph Pieper. And here, this beautiful quote at the end.
Read it to us?
So Balthasar is saying that this quote from Pieper brings the complex problems treated in this final chapter back to the theme of the title. In theological hope, the antithesis between divine justice and divine mercy is, as it were, removed.
Notice he has quotes around both of those.
Yes.
Okay? And this is kind of reference to Hegel, where you have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And so what he's saying is that it's an antithesis, not in the sense that it is on the same level as a thesis, but it's sublimated, so to speak, in something which is higher. Go ahead. Good.
Thank you for that. Not so much theoretically as existentially. And I've always said this work is about the existential experience of the Christian under judgment. Supernatural hope is man's appropriate existential answer to the fact that these qualities in God, which to the creature appear to be contradictory, are actually identical. One who looks only at the justice of God is as little able to hope as is the one who sees only the mercy of God. Both fall prey to hopelessness, one to the hopelessness of despair, the other to the hopelessness of presumption. Only hope is able to comprehend the reality of God that surpasses all antitheses, to know that his mercy is identical with his justice and his justice with his mercy.
And again, that if you know so many people are in hell, that leads to despair. If you know we're all going to heaven, that's presumption. So that kind of idea of justice and of mercy, they don't correlate. They're overcome by God's justice and mercy, which are one, which are identical. I mean, that is a phenomenal quote.
It's a phenomenal quote, and it reminds me a bit of the fabulous short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne, Young Goodman Brown, which also this don't peer into the gloom. So what happens? Young Goodman Brown meets the devil. Now, if I met the devil, please God, I'll just go running in the other direction. I'm not going to have a conversation with him. But no, Goodman Brown goes ahead, has a conversation with the father of lies. And he says, oh, you know, your wife, and in the short story, her name is Faith. And the devil tells young Goodman Brown that his wife is faithless. And he can prove it to him if he comes with him to the forest in the night, and he'll reveal the truth about this man's wife. Now, you're crazy to go with the devil anywhere, never mind in the woods in the night and listen to what he has to say. So anyway, Brown is a fool, and he goes with the devil into the woods, and he not only sees the sins of his wife, so supposedly, I mean, why are you even believing what you're seeing since it's the devil laying it out for you? But anyway, he also sees the sins of all of his neighbors, supposedly. Remember, the devil is the accuser, not the Lord. The devil is the accuser. So now Brown, in the company of the devil, is accusing all his neighbors and his wife of their hidden sins. Poor Brown is never the same again, and he dies in despair. Why? Because he lost hope. He lost hope for his neighbors, and in losing hope for his neighbors, he lost hope for himself. I mean, this is genius, Nathaniel Hawthorne, understanding, first of all, don't have conversations with the devil. Second of all, don't believe his lies. Third of all, don't peer into the gloom with him, right? But keep your eyes on the Lord and keep your faith, hope, and charity alive. And it was interesting. Once the man lost his hope, what came next? His charity. And died. It's a chilling story. It's perfect to read around Halloween time.
That's also, I think, a perfect way to conclude our discussion of this section, which is really the first book that he wrote.
Yes.
So let's come back next session and take the sort of response to critics called A Short Discourse on Hell. God bless you all.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumedbookclub.ignatius.com.